The Tom Woods Show, episode 2084.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey folks, a lot of your friends believe that deregulation caused the financial crisis of 2008 just as fervently as they believe that lockdowns are the solution to COVID-19. For the sake of our future, both of these ideas need to be smashed, so check out my free ebook, The Deregulation Boogeyman, over at regulationmyths.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Our old friend Rainer Zietelmann is back with us today. We're going to talk about his book, Hitler's National Socialism, just released. There's a lot we can talk about here. Of course, we're going to talk about Hitler's views on economic policy, planning the economy, his views on Stalin and Stalin's experience, planning the economy, his views on economics as a science and the body of economic theory, and also just the way he thinks about society and democracy, questions like that. So, Professor Zietelmann, welcome back to the show.
Hello. Nice to meet you again, Tom.
I'm very, very impressed with this book. I don't think I ever told you, but years ago, I asked an old friend of mine who is deceased now, a U.S. historian named Ralph Raico. I asked him for a good source on understanding Hitler's ideology and in particular his economic views, and he recommended one of your books to me. And that's how I found out about you, was from Professor Raico. Now you have this brand new book, very big book, Hitler's National Socialism. Let me start with this question. There is a controversy that exists among, let's say, people on social media, people who believe in the free market, people who don't believe in the free market. Everybody wants to know what were Hitler's opinions on this subject. And you hear some people saying, well, his party was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It has the word socialist in it. So right away, we have at least a presumption that he was some kind of socialist. But then on the other hand, we have socialists who, of course, do not want Hitler associated with their views, saying he couldn't have been a socialist because, after all, Hitler persecuted socialists. Can you navigate us through Hitler's views on the question of economics and socialism and whether and how they evolved over time?
Yes, thank you for the question. Of course, the fact that a term socialism is in the name of the party, it's not enough because it could be something like fraud. And this is what especially leftist people will tell you, that it was nothing like as propaganda and a fraud. And of course, he was not in a typical way a socialist in the same way like, for example, the communists. But on the other hand, he didn't believe in market economy and he didn't believe in capitalism. On the contrary, he wanted to abolish it. But what's important to understand that he has had a very different strategy from those of traditional socialists. Because, like they did in Russia and in other socialist countries, they nationalized all property, all means of production. And this is not what was Hitler's idea. As we know, Hitler's method rarely consisted of simply radically removing an institution or organization, but rather of continuing to erode its inner substance until there was virtually nothing left in its original function or original content. Maybe this sounds a little bit abstract, but only for the sake of the analogy, you should note that the constitution of the Republic of Weimar was never repealed either, but that its substance and intentions were eroded little by little, thereby abolished in practice. And this was a different strategy than to nationalize everything. This is the first thing you have to be aware of. The other thing is that it's not very easy to say what Hitler thought before he came to power, because he kept his plans strictly secretly, primarily in order not to offend businessmen. I will give you one quote from his talks with Otto Wagner. This was the chief of the economic policy section of the NSDAP. And Hitler underlined the importance of keeping his economic plans secret. Hear this quote. The conclusion from this is what I have said all along, that this idea is not to become a subject for propaganda or even for any sort of discussion, except within the innermost study group. It can only be implemented in any case when we hold political power in our hands. And even then, we will have as opponents, besides the Jews, all of private industry, particularly heavy industry, as well as the medium and large landholders, and naturally the banks. This is a quote from Hitler, 1931. And this is one thing that he wanted to keep things a secret. And the other thing is that on the one hand, he believed in competition. You know, he was a socio-Darwinist, and he believed in the process of selection and competition. And in this way, he was in favor of private ownership. But on the other hand, he believed in the primacy of politics and that the state should control everything. And maybe to finish with one quote from Hitler, what makes very clear how he thought. It was in May 1937. He declared in a speech, I will give you now the quote. I tell German industry, for example, you have to produce such and such now. I then return to this in the 4-year plan. If German industry were to answer me, we are not able to, then I will take it over myself, but it must be done. But if the industry tells me we will do that, then I'm very glad that I don't need to take that on. You know, this is not what we understand with capitalism or so, when the state dictates the industrialists what they should do and how and where they should invest.
I find it very interesting to read in your book what Hitler had to say about Stalin's economic planning. Can you say a word about that?
Yes, absolutely. I spoke now about the 4-year plan in 1936. And even then, in 1936, he wrote a memorandum about the 4-year plan. And he was convinced that the planned economy was very successful and that it was really a threat. And then during the war, and this is, I think, the important message, and I give a lot of facts in my book to prove it, during the war, he became more and more a believer in planned economy. And this was a result because he admired Stalin. Of course, you will find nothing like this in his speeches, because this was our propaganda. He always spoke of this so-called Jewish Bolshevism and so, but he didn't believe in it. He didn't believe it, and we know this because almost every night he had this monologues in his inner circle. We call it the so-called table talks. And what is very important, we have minutes from people who wrote down everything that he said only for his inner circle. And this was a huge difference what he said in public. I will give you 1 or 2 quotes. People will be very surprised about it. Here is one quote from August 1942, what Hitler said about Stalin. He said, if Stalin had continued to work for another 10 to 15 years, Soviet Russia would have become the most powerful nation on earth. 150, 200, 300 years may go by. That is such a unique phenomenon. That the general standard of living rose, there can be no doubt. The people did not suffer from hunger. Taking everything together, we have to say, they built factories here where 2 years ago there was nothing but forgotten villages, factories which are as big as the Hermann Göring works in Germany. They have railways that are not even marked on the maps. Here with us, we argue about the tariffs before the railways even built. I have a book about Stalin. One has to say that is an enormous personality, a real ascetic who has brought the huge empire together with an iron fist. Only when someone says that is a social state, then that is a gigantic swindle. It is a national capital state, 200 million people, iron, magnesia, nickel, oil, petroleum, and what you like, unlimited. At the head, a man who said, do you think the loss of 30 million people is too much for a great idea? So you see, this was the dictator Hitler who really admired Stalin. There are a lot of other similar quotes from his inner circle, and especially he admired the planned economy. He said a lot of times that in the United States and capitalist countries, there are so many people out of work, but they were not in Russia. Of course, this is all crazy what he said, that in Russia did not suffer from hunger. We know it today. Millions and millions in the Ukraine, for example, died at this time when, Stalin attacks against the so-called kulaks and all this. But Hitler believed in the superiority of the planned economy and Stalin. And even sometimes when he saw that he was going to lose the war, he said, Stalin did better than I did because he killed all the old elites. He said, this is what we must to do.
A few minutes ago, you used a phrase about the primacy of politics. And in your book, you say that really the key to understanding Hitler's views is in this expression that he believed in the primacy of politics and the secondary role of economics. What did he mean by that?
Yes, this is absolutely true. It means that Hitler only recognizes private ownership insofar as it is used according to this principle, I say it in German, Gemeinwohl vor Eigenwohl. This means common benefit ahead of private benefit, which means correctly insofar as it is used within the framework of the objective set by the states. For Hitler, the principle of common benefit ahead of private benefit means that if it is necessary in the common interest, the state has the right at all times to decide on the way, the extent, and the time private ownership is used. And the common interest is, of course, defined by the state. And what I found now, I didn't know this when I wrote my book. I didn't know what Ludwig von Mises wrote, but I found a letter to the editor of the New York Times from Ludwig von Mises. And he analyzed exactly the same. Here I have it. It was a letter, and you can find this quote not in my book because a colleague of you told me about this letter. And it's an amazing letter from Ludwig von Mises. It's from June 18, 1942. And please allow me to give you a quote because he understood absolutely 100% what did this primacy of politics mean for the National Socialists. He wrote, the German pattern of socialism is characterized by the fact that it maintains, although only nominally, some institutions of capitalism. Private ownership has been nominally untouched. In fact, however, the former entrepreneurs have been reduced to the status of shop managers. The government tells them what and how to produce, at what prices, and from whom to buy, at what prices, and to whom to sell. Business may remonstrate against inexpedient injunctions, but the final decision rests on the authorities. And I think Mises, he understood better than a lot of historians understood it today. Because, let me repeat it because this is so important. There are two ways to abolish private property or private ownership. The one is the old version, nationalization. The other one is that you are nominally the owner, but the state tells you what you should do, what not, and so. And I think this means, in fact, abolishing of private ownership, because private ownership doesn't mean only that you have the formal title, but that you can use it, that you can invest where you want and what you want, and that you can make your own decisions. And what you have to understand, this is the difference between the old way of nationalization and the new way. And to tell you honestly, this is also a problem today, not only in National Socialism. I see today, especially in Europe, but maybe also in the United States, I see the tendency that, private ownership remains, but the states, the government officials, or the politicians tell the owners what they should do and what not. We have this in Brussels, for example, in the European Union, a very strong tendency. And I think we should understand that this never worked in history.
I think there's another way, even though it's not the sense in which Hitler meant the expression primacy of politics, secondary role of economics, but there is another way in which he believed in this. Now, I don't know if Hitler read Schmoller or any of the German historical school thinkers, but he definitely agreed with them when they were disputing what the Austrians later on, Mises, would say, that economics consists of a series of cause and effect relationships that persist across time and in all different places, and they're universal, they're universally applicable. The German historical school denied this, that there were universally applicable economic regularities, economic laws. And what this meant, I think, for politicians was that instead of economics being a constraint on what they could accomplish, economics was a pseudoscience. It was not a real science. And we don't need to pay attention to what these theoreticians have to say, because these theoreticians don't understand real life. But I, the politician, understand real life. So I don't need to be constrained by their theoretical propositions. I roll up my sleeves and I deal with the real world. That sounds exactly like what Hitler says.
Absolutely. This is 100%. And by the way, it's a mistake if you believe, or a lot of people, we have this picture about Hitler as someone absolutely crazy in his speeches, shouting and very irrational and emotional. But this is not true. Of course, he was absolutely without any moral, and of course, he was a criminal. But this doesn't mean that he was stupid. He read thousands of books about history, politics, and even about, of course, military and economy. And, this is something that I show in my book, that in spite of the fact that, of course, you can't discuss what he was one of the worst dictators in all history, beside others with like Stalin and Mao. But this doesn't mean that he was, in a way, stupid. The same way as Lenin, for example, or Mao Zedong. They were not stupid. And I think people make themselves too easy. And if you read my book, then you see that he had a world view. In German, we call it Weltanschauung, the way I think worldview is maybe a good translation, that it is consistent in itself. And a long time ago, some people thought that he understood absolutely nothing, or he was not interested in the economy. But this is wrong. For example, the reason why he wanted to conquer this, what he called living space, neuer Lebensraum in the East, in Russia and the Ukraine, these were economic reasons. This is another chapter in my book where I prove it, that these were economic reasons. And so I was very surprised, because when I did this research for a lot of years, it's a long time ago, and I think I was the first one to read all these thousands of speeches from Hitler, analyze it, but as well, not only the speeches in public, but also about his monologues in his inner circle. And you have a lot of other sources, like Joseph Goebbels, for example. He had diaries for a lot of years. He made everyday notes, and sometimes you find remarks what Hitler said. And a lot of people know that he wrote one book, Mein Kampf, but he wrote also another book. We call it Hitler's second book. He wrote it in 1928, but it was never published. So what I mean, there are a lot of sources, essays, speeches, these two books, these so-called monologues or table talks in the inner circle. And if you put this all together, and this is what I do in my book, you can make a reconstruction what he really thought and to understand it on different fields. And you find in the way that it is a system that is in itself consistent, but of course without any kind of morals. So you see here what the quote about Stalin, what he admired with Stalin, that he said, one with an iron fist, and he said, 30 million people died for a great idea. Is this too much? And Hitler thought like this.
Hey, folks, quick message from your old friend Woods, who is looking out for what's best for you. And I got to remind you the importance of taking care of your loved ones. Having life insurance through your job may not be enough. Most people need up to 10 times more coverage to provide for their families. So that's where Policy Genius comes in. Policy Genius is your one-stop shop to find and buy the insurance you need. You head to policygenius.com, you answer a few questions, And in minutes, you'll be comparing personalized quotes from top companies to find your lowest price. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. The team of licensed experts at Policy Genius will help you understand your options and apply for the policy you choose. And the Policy Genius team works for you, not the insurance company. So you can trust them to offer unbiased help and advocate for you at every step until you're covered. They don't add on extra fees. They don't sell your info to third parties. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they have options that offer coverage in as little as a week and avoid unnecessary medical exams. And since 2014, Policy Genius has helped over 30 million people shop for insurance. Head to policygenius.com to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com. Let's shift gears for a minute and talk about the political system that Hitler favored and his views on democracy. Now, the impression that I have had as not really a historian of Germany, but reasonably well-informed person is something like this, that his view was that democracy, in quotation marks, as it's practiced in a number of Western countries, is largely a sham because in practice, the people wind up being ruled by various interest groups. So what's needed, if you really want to carry into effect the will of the people, is a man who is strong enough to implement the will of the people and override these interest groups. So somebody who is intimately familiar with the spirit and desires of his people so that he can implement them without these interlopers getting in the way and substituting their will for the will of the people. Is that how he viewed his role?
Yes, absolutely. And what is surprising, I'm very familiar with the communist or Marxist criticism on democracy. One reason is because when I was young, when I was a teenager, I was a Marxist, to admit it. I read all these books from Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. I have a very in-depth knowledge about it. And I found a lot of analogies, especially in the criticism of democracy, because Hitler was of the opinion that in reality, in the democratic states, that the capitalists rule. For example, like the United States. It's not only about the Jews, of course, we know his hatred against the Jewish people, but the Jewish people were for him, the representatives of financial capital. And he was on the opinion that in the democracy, it's not the power of the people, but it's the power of the capitalists. And I think this is a very similar view to the view that you find with communists who criticize democracy. And there were, in the time of the National Socialism, there were also some so-called votes. Yes, when he did something, then he let people vote, but he was very cynical. In one speech, he said, for example, maybe you criticize me, you let also people vote for some decision in foreign policy. But then he said, but the difference, I act first and then I let people vote. And if I would have been of the opinion that they don't vote in the way that I want, then I would have acted in the same way, but then I wouldn't have let them vote. This is his in one of his speeches, a cynical approach to democracy.
One last thing I want to ask you about involves an ongoing controversy regarding understanding who Hitler really was ideologically. There was a polyglot scholar in the U.S. who, well, actually, maybe he was probably lived in Europe most of his life, now that I think about it, but I don't know how well he was known in Europe. But Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn wrote a book called Leftism, and then he wrote Leftism Revisited, in which he advanced the thesis that there were so many revolutionary aspects of Hitler's thought that he could not be considered a man of the right, that he basically belonged on the left. In fact, I believe the subtitle of Kuehnelt-Leddin's book, the second half of the subtitle, it was Leftism Revisited, from so-and-so to Hitler and Pol Pot. And the subtitle is meant to be striking because nobody would have associated Hitler with the left, and he just casually inserted Hitler's name into the subtitle. On the other hand, a present-day scholar, Paul Gottfried, who is a friend of this program, disagrees and says that clearly Hitler was a man of the right. Now, some people may think this is all just meaningless semantics, and those people can skip this question, but I find this very interesting. Where do you come down on this question, left or right?
I'm in the middle. I think it's wrong to say Hitler was right or reactionary. On the other hand, it's too easy to call him left-wing. But I give you a little food of thought. We have here, or we had here, a German-British publicist. His name was Sebastian Haffner, who wrote a very good essay about Hitler. And he pointed out that the only opposition which could get really have become dangerous for Hitler came from the right. And indeed, this is correct. The only effective opposition to Hitler represented by conservative and in part also monarchistic forces. For example, the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on July 20, 1944. These were more right-wing people. And if you look how Hitler saw himself, I have a lot of quotes in my book. And so also I like to give you here a quote to this topic. Here in 1941, he remembered the so-called time of struggle in one of his monologues in his inner circle. And he said, "My party at the time consisted of 90% of people from the left. I could only use people who had fought." This was certainly an exaggeration, but we know that from recent analysis of the NSDAP membership list by the political scientist Jürgen Falter, that 40% of National Socialist Workers' Party members were indeed workers. And the same is true for the party voters. And so if you ask how Hitler saw himself, he did not regard himself as being either on the left or on the right, but wanted to overcome both extremes, but of course not in the middle, however, but in a new extreme in which both were abolished. So here, maybe a last quote for today from 1944. He said, "In those days, the definitions of both terms were diametrically opposed to each other. The one was on the right side of the barricade and the other on the left. And I went right in between these two fighters. In other words, climbed up on the barricade itself and therefore was naturally shot by both. I attempted to define a new term under the motto that in the end, nationalism and socialism are the same, under the one condition, namely that the nation moves into the center of all desire. Those days, I had heavy battles, both from the left as well from the right." So this was the way as he saw himself. So I would say it's definitely wrong to say that Hitler was right-wing, but it makes things too easy to say that he was left-wing. He was an extremist who took things from both sides. And
he took the worst things from both sides.
Yes, especially what he thought the best was the worst, the collectivism. This way, as he saw, nationalism and socialism was really the same. You're absolutely right. He took the worst from both sides.
Before we wrap up, you were telling me that you will be at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas this summer, so people listening will have an opportunity to meet you. What are you going to be doing there?
Yes, I can't tell here in public, but hopefully it's not 100% clear that I produced a film, and hopefully it will be shown at Las Vegas. So hopefully I can meet you there. And of course, I will be there, and I plan to go to the United States then in September and in October. I spoke now with Students for Liberty. Maybe I go to some universities, and I will speak about two topics, about this topic of my book, Hitler's National Socialism, but also about another thing. My book, The Power of Capitalism. And in this book, I compare socialism and capitalism, but not on the level of abstract theory, but, I'm an historian, and I think it's a very good example to compare East and West Germany, because the same history, the same language, the same culture, but one part of the country, it was planned economy. The other part, it was market economy. And I think now, today, a lot of people don't know anything about it. I give you only, this is another topic, but I think very interesting. I give you, for example, these facts. Today, we discuss about environmental problems and climate change. And a lot of people think that capitalism is the reason for this. But what they don't know, that environmental problems were much, much bigger in socialist countries, especially in East Germany, than they were ever in West Germany. Or we speak about housing problems. Young people, I understand they have sometimes problems to find a flat. And so a lot of people don't know. And you can compare it with East and West Germany. That, for example, in 1989, believe it or not, 27% of the people in East Germany had not their own bathroom. They had to use a bathroom outside their houses, or only 16% had a telephone. At the same time, 99% in West Germany had a telephone. And then if you speak about cars, people don't know it. I ask them always, if I have lectures, what do you think how long you had to wait for a car in East Germany? It was exactly between 12 and 17 years. 12 and 17 years. You had to wait for a car. You had to subscribe or list, then wait this. Of course, you could buy a used car. And, this was the so-called Trabi, famous as being the worst car in the world. And even for this car, you had to wait between 12 and 17 years. And you could buy a used one, but then you had to sometimes to pay more than for a new one. And there are a lot of facts in my book, The Power of Capitalism. And so I plan to come to the United States, have some lectures about what I understand a lot of. It's about German history. And I think it's a great lesson about capitalism and socialism, not on the level of abstract theory, but real life history.
Well, I will have to get you back to discuss that topic because that is at least as important as this one. Well, the book we've been discussing is Hitler's National Socialism. I'll link to it at tomwoods.com/2084, written by our guest, Rainer Zitelmann. Thank you so much for your time today, and I do hope we can talk again soon.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
All right, everybody, that'll do it for today. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about what on earth to do with your money in a situation like we're living through right now. So look forward with great anticipation to episode 2085, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by